Our story begins in the academy with an explosion. Our protagonist Haruto was thrown to the ground, and a man teasingly told him that he hadn't realized he was there. The man with green hair then asked him if he really just got hit by elementary magic and told him that he was fucking amazing as he struggled to stand up in pain. When he managed to stand, he asked the man if it wasn't enough and told him to return it to him as promised because he had brought what he asked for. The man raised the bag of food and told everyone that it was the fresh sirloin burger, the famous limited school lunch with only 50 pieces sold per day. He confirmed that he did get enough for all of them, but the green-haired man asked him where the drink was. The man retorted that he should have been more considerate. Then, releasing a fireball in his hand, he threw it at him while shouting that, as punishment for not bringing drinks, he should have another serving. This hit him and made him fall to the ground once again. He then stood up again while the men teasingly told him that, as they expected, he was exceptionally weak. Suddenly, a lady furiously asked the men what they were doing. The men noticed that it was Shinjuku, and they all knew that she was part of the disciplinary committee. The man then threw his cell phone at his face while shouting for him to be grateful it was all he had for today. The cell phone cracked when it hit the ground. Shinjuku rushed to him and calls in worry as he was picking up his phone. She asked him if he was okay, but he told her to stop and that she'd be excluded as well if she hung out with him. She sadly told him that it wasn't something she cared about, but he angrily told her that they couldn't survive in that place if they hung out like they did when they were little. Then he walked away, leaving her sadly calling his name. He then walked into the building, and the students whispered that he was the special admission student. They asked how he managed to enter such a prestigious school when he has zero magic capacity. They also whispered that they had heard there was an error in the scoring system and wondered if he had a stand-in to take the exam for him. Although Haruto doesn't want to admit it, he can't deny the rumors questioning how an underachieving student like himself got into that prestigious school. One day, out of nowhere, his parents suddenly informed him of his admission as a special admission student, and even if he had wanted to ask them why, it was too late. He looked up at the sky and wondered if maybe he should have died along with them that day. Haruto was admitted to the school with zero magic capacity, so he couldn't major in the mage course. Consequently, he was forced to become a swordsman, and in the current society where magic is overwhelmingly dominant, he was considered useless, only able to fight in melee range. Being the only survivor in his family and a constant burden in dungeon raids, they gave him the nickname the God of Plagues. After his class, he returned to his apartment building and opened his door, but before he walked inside, he noticed a letter on his door. He sat down, holding the letter, and noticed that there wasn't a stamp nor a sender's name, but he decided to open it anyway. When he peeled back the sealed sticker, he was surprised as a powerful light emanated from it. The light enveloped him while he was in shock, and eventually, the letter dragged him inside. He opened his eyes to find his surroundings were colorful, which made him anxiously ask where he was. The water he stepped on parted, and a shadow emerged. The shadow, smiling, told him that it was the year 2054 according to the Western calendar, and asked if he was indeed the 16-year-old Kujyou Haruto, to which he stutteringly replied yes. The shadow told him that his name was Kujyou Haruto and that he was him from the future. He explained that he was sending the letter from the future and that in 10 years, he would become a mage able to manipulate space and time. However, waiting that long was too much, so he decided to train him right there and then to become a grand mage of space and time. Haruto stared at the shadow, wondering what the man was saying. His future self told him he knew he was skeptical because he was him but insisted that a picture was worth 1,000 words, and just once, he should do as he tells him. His future self then instructed him to enter the F-Rank dungeon, Shinjuku Imperial Garden, alone, and said he would speak to him again after he had done it. The shadow then disappeared. A moment later, he entered the Shinjuku Imperial Garden, an F-Rank dungeon. He knew that a cleared dungeon like this one didn't really have anything worth taking. He then told his future self that if this was some kind of prank, he should know what would happen. His future self replied that he could burn and tear the letter as he liked and instructed him to go straight and turn right at the end. Clenching his teeth in frustration, he followed the directions and a moment later, he faced a wall. He told his future self that he had reached a dead end and asked if he could burn him now, but his future self simply told him to put the letter into the slit in the wall. He sighed and inserted the letter into the slit. To his shock, the slit lit up and the wall moved aside, creating enough space for him to walk through. He walked inside, having never heard of something like a hidden route. Suddenly, something bright lit up the dark hidden space and then he saw a huge crystal tied by a chain. His future self told him that it was a skill cube and asked him if it was the first time he had seen one. His future self then ordered him to touch it and acquire the skill. He walked closer to it with apprehension and touched it, but then his future self apologized to him. Suddenly, the skill cube cracked and turned red. Then a purple light appeared around the skill cube, and a hole opened above him. It began to suck in the blocks around him and started to form something in mid-air. When it finished sucking in the blocks at high speed and forming the object, The smoke slowly disappeared, revealing a huge form in front of him. He was stunned in horror when he saw glowing eyes, and then a golem jumped closer to him. It stared at him with its one bright eye, and he wondered if it really was a golem. But then it attacked him swiftly, hitting him and throwing him away in pain. With blurry eyes, he wondered what was happening and if he had been scammed. Suffering severe injuries, he felt hot and realized that his entire body was burning. He noticed his consciousness fading and wondered if he was going to die. He then looked at his phone, saw images of his mother, his father, and his little sister Ria, and told them that he could finally be with the rest of them. But then the letter lit up, and his future self asked him if it was okay. It reminded him that he was a failure at the school his parents had enrolled him in and that he was going to die, a pointless death, after being scammed by him. It then asked him if he was really okay with that, which jolted him back to consciousness. He remembered his miserable life where nothing good ever happened. However, he realized that it was just his life and he had convinced himself that this was how it was supposed to be, so he had given up. He replied that there was no way he would be okay with it, and it told him that if that was the case, he should resist, survive resiliently, and change his miserable life. When the golem's attack was about to hit him, he didn't avoid it and was killed. But he still managed to defiantly tell it not to mess with him in a place like this. Suddenly, the system displayed a hidden quest in the Shinjuku Imperial Garden, an F-Rank dungeon, and he had met the requirement for the Mage of Space and Time's indomitable spirit. Therefore, his adventurer's death was cancelled and his physical body would undergo a rollback. He then opened his eyes, confident that he would survive. When he met the requirements, the skill cube shattered into pieces, releasing a powerful force that headed straight for where he was lying. The powerful force hit him directly, and in the golem's eyes, he was standing. His body was surging with strong electrified power. The system then showed that he had acquired space-time magic, along with quick body, material rewind, and stop chain. It also indicated that he had obtained the space-time mage passive skill, level 1 potential unleashing, with a plus 30% boost. However, he just looked at his hand and asked, "What the hell is this?" His future self explained that taking a shortcut to his awakening required potentially fatal, harsh conditions. His future self then apologized for not informing him beforehand. He revealed that space-time magic would not be discovered for another 10 years because it was part of a hidden quest that, until now, only he had encountered. He asked his future self if he was really from the future, but his future self simply told him that he looked alive now and that the tutorial was about to start, while the golem behind him was ready to squeeze him. When the golem launched an attack, he felt it and immediately looked back, managing to jump away in time to dodge the golem's hand. He then noticed that his body felt so light, making him wonder if it was the effect of the passive skill. His future self told him that he would teach him how a space-time mage is supposed to fight and that he shouldn't use his eyes to see, but just feel it, the flow of time that rules the world. He followed the order, and his future self proudly told him that he could absolutely do it because he was him, after all. The golem launched its huge fist at him, but he didn't move and tried to concentrate, feeling the flow of time. When the golem's fist was an inch away, he opened his eyes, stared into the golem's eyes, and jumped away in time to dodge it. He then activated his space-time magic and landed on the golem's hand. Using his quick body, he jumped in front of the golem, ran up the golem's arm, and when he reached the top, he launched his sword at the golem's head while telling the golem that it must be its core. He then plunged his sword into the golem's head and pushed down with all his strength, cracking the core inside its head. Gradually, the golem's head cracked further until it exploded into pieces. He descended to the ground and walked away while the golem's body shattered behind him. After defeating the golem, his level increased by 4, his swordsman's skill by 8, and he obtained 45,800 credits. As he stared at the system, his future self asked him if he believed him now and called him God of Plagues. He gripped his sword tightly and replied that somewhat, he did. His future self then told him that for the next necessary step, he should exit the dungeon. He asked his future self if there was still something else left to do, to which his future self replied yes, and that there was just a little detour for him to make. They were going to where Shinjuku would be killed by a monster today. He stopped walking upon hearing this and was shocked when he realized what was said. He then asked his future self to repeat what he had said. His future self explained that he was talking about his childhood friend Shinjuku, who, along with some friends, would enter the Kujyou D-rank dungeon today and be killed by the extra boss monster. He positioned his feet as his future self urged him to go save Shinjuku and change the future. His future self then called him a mage of space and time as he rushed out of the dungeon. While he was rushing, his future self told him that on May 23, 2054, in the Western calendar, in the deepest part of the Kujyou D-rank dungeon, an unexpected appearance of a C-rank extra boss would result in the death of Shinjuku Rin. Despite her party member casting a rescue spell, there were no other adventurers around, and hence, they were completely wiped out. Although Shinjuku wasn't entirely at fault, before his future self could say more, he shouted at him to shut up. A moment later, he arrived in the Ikebukuro D-rank dungeon. Exhaustedly, he asked his future self why he hadn't said anything earlier, but his future self merely asked him back if he wasn't the one who had wanted to avoid associating with anyone else because anyone he came into contact with would meet with misfortune. He reminded him that this was also the reason why he was rather comfortable being shunned and asked him why he was so angry on another's behalf. Suddenly, he was stopped by a momentary pause as goblins surrounded him, but his future self told him to stop acting as if he had suddenly become enlightened. He grabbed his sword from behind his back, and when the goblins leaped together to attack him, he slashed them swiftly. His future self told him that the world could be changed by his actions, but he just told his future self to shut up and that he would do whatever he wanted. His future self replied that he understood and that this was the response he was looking for. As a reward, he would teach him an application of space-time magic. Meanwhile, on the deepest floor, a huge explosion could be heard along with screams, and Shinjuku was thrown into midair. She slammed onto the ground while her friends watched in horror. They worriedly called her name, but she couldn't stand up because of the pain. When she opened her eyes, she saw the C-rank extra boss, Dark Sentinel, in front of them. A man shouted that they hadn't been informed about it, and a lady who was trying to call for help shouted in panic that it was no use because there was no response to the rescue spell. Another lady urged them to calm down and told them that if they all attacked at once, they had a chance of winning. But the man stutteringly replied no, that he couldn't do it, and that he didn't want to die. Dark Sentinel lit its huge sword while the lady shouted at the man that now was not the time to be saying something like that. But then Dark Sentinel swung its sword toward them, and it hit all of them, throwing them into mid-air together. Shinjuku managed to sit up and was shocked to see that all her friends were down on the ground. Many had collapsed, but then she saw one of her friends still alive and begging for help, so she pushed herself to stand and attack the Dark Sentinel with her firepower. She managed to hit it in the head, but it didn't even scratch the Sentinel, leaving her stunned in horror. The Dark Sentinel raised its sword, and as it swung down toward her, she closed her eyes in tears and shouted for someone to help. Fortunately, he appeared just in time and used his stop chain skill to halt the Dark Sentinel's attack. He then asked her if she was alright. She opened her eyes, stunned to see him there, but he simply faced the Dark Sentinel and told her to stay back. He deactivated his stop chain skill, grabbed his sword from behind, and jumped away to dodge the Dark Sentinel's sword. He then jumped behind it, and as it turned around quickly to attack him again, he blocked its attack with his sword and swung at its stomach, knowing that was the spot, but his attack was merely blocked by its armor, making him realize it was too hard. The Dark Sentinel launched another attack, which he blocked with his sword, trying his best to compete with it. Unfortunately, his sword cracked under the force and broke in half. The Dark Sentinel stared at him in anger, making him curse under his breath. It then gathered power from its eyes and pointed it at him, releasing a strong power that caused an explosion. Using his quick body skill and time, he ran away and appeared behind it. Knowing that his sword didn't work on its armor but was effective on parts not covered, he realized he needed to focus on its head. The Dark Sentinel turned around, and he immediately launched his broken sword at its head. His future self reminded him that his sword was going to break, but he simply replied that he knew. He then used his material rewind skill, and as his sword began to repair itself, he launched it at the Dark Sentinel's head, which was gathering power again. The tip of his sword struck the Dark Sentinel's eye just in time, piercing through to the helmet. The head then became powerless, and he managed to land safely on the ground. His future self then told him that it seems he had changed fate itself, while Shinjuku stared at him in shock and confusion. A moment later, Shinjuku rushed to him, asking what in the world was going on and shouting at him to explain. But she decided to thank him first for saving her and her friends. He told her not to worry about it and pleadingly asked her if she could keep it a secret for now. She thought for a moment and asked if, in other words, that would be a secret just between the two of them. He confusedly replied yes, that it would be like that. She smiled upon hearing it and then asked him what the source of his strength was earlier. He was about to reply when his future self told him that he wanted to keep future branching routes to a minimum and abstain from making any careless comments about space-time magic. He stopped upon hearing his future self but asked Shinjuku if she could keep what he was about to tell her a secret too. She looked at him in confusion, but he explained that a lot was going on, and he didn't want to stand out. His future self then suggested that he should deceive her somehow, which Shinjuku overheard, and asked if the voice she just heard was him. Shocked, he replied that it was not him at all and he didn't know what she was talking about. He then glared angrily at the letter and swore to kill his future self later for it. He sighed and told Shinjuku that he wanted to try out a special swordsman skill he had been training with forever, but since it was still incomplete, it wasn't something to tell everyone about. She smilingly replied that she understood and, if that was the case, she would keep the secret, making him sigh in relief, knowing that he had somehow managed to deceive her. Just like that, Shinjuku Rin's supposedly fated death was averted, and at the same time, Haruto was able to obtain overwhelming magic and power. Haruto knew he couldn't change the past, but he could continue to change what was yet to come. Suddenly, someone called him God of Plagues, and when he looked back, he saw the bullying men at the door, calling him and teasingly laughing at him. A moment later, one man told him that he heard he went into the Ikebukuro dungeon yesterday, and a guy he happened to see told him that he just ran home, powerless, without being able to be of any use. Another man teasingly told them that it seemed they even ran into an extra boss and had to take a training session with it, which made them laugh. The man asked his friends if it was expected of the God of Plagues, but Haruto was just busy wondering who the witness was besides Shinjuku. The man then told him that a buddy of his was also there and ended up being carried to the hospital with severe injuries, so the hospitalization expenses would be hefty. The man then gestured for money and asked if he understood what he meant by that. He then demanded that he pay up, and in return, they wouldn't tell anyone about it. The men then asked him what he had to say, but he remained silent, infuriating them and prompting them to demand he say something. The man then conjured a fire in his hand and reminded him that he would become their target for practicing attack spells again. He shouted that he had had enough, which made the man stretch his hands in anger and ask him to repeat what he just said. Defiantly, he reiterated that he'd had enough and asked them if they were deaf pieces of trash, which enraged the man and his companions. They launched an attack at him in anger while calling him a bastard, but he was thankful for his increased stats as he could clearly see the scumbags' movements. He then swiftly attacked them one by one. He stopped behind them. They all looked around in horror, wondering what was going on. He told them to listen well and warned them not to come near him ever again, or else the same thing would happen. He was holding their wallets and a lighter. One of the men shouted that those wallets were theirs, but he simply lit the lighter and told them that it was a promise between them and him. He then seriously asked them what they said, to which they all nodded in fear. After that, they all ran away. He thought they wouldn't mess with him anymore and decided to go back to his class. A moment later, he was sitting in the class, noticing that their next class was magic capacity measurement. The teacher announced that they would begin that semester's magic capacity measurement immediately and called his name. He replied yes and stood up to walk to the front. He knew that his intrinsic magic capacity was almost zero, but he wondered how things would turn out now that he was a space-time mage. He decided to try pouring some space-time magic into the mirror as a test. He placed his hand on the mirror and infused it with his space-time magic. After that, he opened his eyes, and the teacher was stunned in confusion when a bright light emanated from the mirror. Suddenly, the mirror exploded and shattered into pieces, causing the teacher to fall to the floor and leaving the students in shock. He realized that he shouldn't have done something so dramatic because it made him stand out unnecessarily, while in the background, Shinjuku giggled. After school, as he exited the building, he heard students whispering, asking if he was the God of Plague who had destroyed the measuring device. They murmured that further inspection revealed it was a form of unknown magic, but other students couldn't believe it, knowing that if it were true, he'd be above rank A. He thought about how different this gossip was from what he used to hear, and felt it was much more exhausting. Suddenly, someone called out to him, so he looked around, confused. The voice then beckoned him into the bushes, and what emerged made him gasp in surprise. The fluffy stuffed toy spoke to him, and he recognized the voice, asking if it was the him from the letter and what was with its form. His future self replied that it was a type of space-time magic that had possessed the plushie at his house. He questioned his future self if this explained everything, but his future self only stated that it was an emergency, as the Chaos Dragon had appeared earlier than in the future he knew of. He asked his future self what he meant by Chaos Dragon, and his future self explained that the Chaos Dragon was bad news because it had destroyed the Adventurers Guild in the Ariake area, resulting in many casualties. It also caused an unprecedented catastrophe and was a monster categorized as an alpha-type extermination target, just as in his future. His future self emphasized that since it appeared earlier than expected, they had to defeat it no matter what. He told his future self that if they didn't, the catastrophic events would repeat themselves, to which his future self agreed, confirming that it was just as it had been in his future. Shocked by the revelation, he shouted to his future self that if that was the case, they had to contact the Adventurers Guild and request an extermination team because, with a squad of high rankers, even the Chaos Dragon would be more manageable. However, his future self just looked back, stating that they couldn't because time was up. Suddenly, he heard something massive approaching from above. When he looked up, he was stunned to see the Chaos Dragon soaring overhead. He asked his future self if the dragon wasn't supposed to be confined to a dungeon, but his future self replied that it was a ferocious migrating species, unlikely to stay in one place. As the dragon flew past them, he cursed in panic, knowing that if it continued on its path, the school would suffer casualties. The students, who had been peacefully exiting the school and engaging in light-hearted chatter, stopped abruptly as darkness enveloped their surroundings. They looked up in horror at the dragon flying above, frozen in shock and questioning why it was there. The dragon stared down at them and dove toward the ground, prompting them to flee back to the safety of the school in terror. A lady shouted for everyone to prepare for battle and instructed the non-mage students to evacuate hastily to the school dorms. Meanwhile, the mages took their positions. He ran after the dragon, shouting back to indicate that the students in front were the student council's mage security guards. The students formed a magic circle and aimed it at the dragon hovering above them. They began attacking the dragon with their magical powers, and the lady in front raised her staff, commanding her team not to let the dragon near the school grounds. She then cast a massive magic circle above the dragon and unleashed an attack that resulted in an explosion. Her team proudly thought they had subdued it, and she smiled as they praised her, but her smile turned to shock when she heard the dragon growling in anger. To their dismay, they realized that their attacks had no effect. It was immune to anti-dragon magic bullets. The dragon then gathered power in its mouth and released a devastating blast toward the student council's mages. The attack hit them directly, giving them no time to escape, and caused massive destruction on the ground. In an instant, the student council's mages' security guards were down. His future self commented that this was to be expected since they were only student mages. He shouted at his future self that now was not the time for such remarks, but his future self simply called his name and, before he could look, threw something at his head. He asked his future self what he was doing, and the reply came that it was dragon incense, a scent that lures dragons. His future self explained that the dragon, being a ferocious migrating species with low intelligence, would now pursue only him. The dragon then swooped down towards him, ready to attack. But his future self sternly told him that he had to face it and show them the power of a space-time mage. The dragon glared at him in anger, and his future self shouted that it was coming their way and urged him to run, which he did. Suddenly, he heard someone asking if they were okay. Turning in surprise, he saw Shinjuku helping the students. His future self asked him if he truly wished to keep Shinjuku out of this ordeal, to which he responded affirmatively. His future self then advised him that the best course of action would be to run, suggesting this would minimize the risk of witnesses to their battle. Using his quick body skill, he sped away with the dragon in hot pursuit. A moment later, he arrived at Tokyo City JR Nakano Station. His future self informed him that the train yard was currently deserted and instructed him to jump over the fence to lure the Chaos Dragon, which he promptly did. Once they were on the other side and waiting for the dragon, he asked his future self about the dragon's characteristics. His future self explained that the dragon belonged to the dark element, possessed very powerful dragon breath, which meant instant death if confronted head-on, and emitted a miasma that caused a delay effect debuff. Furthermore, it had physical attack resistance, meaning it was impervious to damage from careless attacks. He asked his future self if this meant it was an absolute monster from 5 years in the future, to which his future self confirmed it was true. However, he added that the dragon was still a juvenile with low intelligence, making it susceptible to the dragon incense. He nodded in understanding, but when his future self mentioned that the incense cost 500,000 credits, he was shocked and asked if his future self truly meant 500,000. His future self affirmed the cost and mentioned withdrawing it from his bank account, which made him grab his future self in shock and demand to know how he knew his PIN number. His future self didn't respond, causing him to curse in frustration. His future self reassured him not to worry, promising that he would easily recoup such a minor sum and that defeating the dragon would bring a substantial reward. Moreover, he emphasized that money was merely the cherry on top. The real prize would be the skill cube dropped by the dragon, which would grant him a new space-time magic spell. His future self then shifted focus back to the task at hand, explaining that the Chaos Dragon had not yet reached its mature form, so its weak point, the dragon core, would be exposed. As his future self was about to reveal the location of the dragon core, the dragon appeared above them, growling menacingly. It hurled a powerful attack at them, but fortunately, they both leapt aside just in time to dodge it. As it gathered power in its mouth once more, he gripped his sword, while his future self shouted a warning. He sarcastically thanked his future self for the useless advice, and then skillfully dodged the dragon's multiple attacks thanks to his quick body spell. When the barrage of attacks ceased, he paused and informed his future self, who was dodging behind him, that he had managed to evade them somehow. However, he was caught off guard when another attack flew directly at him and struck him, causing him to scream in pain as an explosion erupted from the impact. Peering through the fog, the dragon noticed a blue light emerging. Shocked, The dragon saw him launching toward it while proclaiming that he was from 0.5 seconds ago. His future self looked on in amazement, wondering if he had just invented a practical application of space-time magic in the heat of the moment. He then leaped toward the dragon's core, and upon seeing it, he was certain it was the target. He swung his sword with all his might at the dragon's core, but felt no connection with his strike, leaving him puzzled. Suddenly, the core unleashed power, and the dragon began to vanish before his eyes. He landed, remarking to his future self that he had not been warned about this ability, prompting his future self to recall and explain that the Chaos Dragon could transform its entire body into miasma, advising him to be cautious during attacks. He sighed and told his future self that next time, he should share such crucial information before a fight. As his future self warned, the dragon could also materialize the miasma to create an army of small dragon-like figures, known as a legion. True to his future self's warning, the Chaos Dragon released these small figures around him, making him question if it was really just juvenile. He then guessed that it couldn't be dealt with by ordinary means. His future self told him that originally, this tough enemy wasn't supposed to appear for another 5 years. He asked his future self why such a monster was appearing now, and the reply came that it might be due to him altering the future, so he should take responsibility and defeat the dragon properly. He sighed in frustration and asked if his future self meant that everything was his fault. Suddenly, one of the small dragons tried to pin him down, but fortunately, he used his quick body spell in time and jumped away. Another small dragon lunged at him, and he slashed it in half with his sword. He then saw that it disappeared, which made him feel relieved because he proved that these small dragons don't transform into miasma when he hits them. His future self told him to scatter the small fry and wait for his chance to attack, but he shouted back that he would do just that even without being told. He then powered up his foot and aimed at his target. He jumped up with speed, slashing every little dragon flying in midair, trying to kill them quickly to conserve energy. A moment later, his future self noticed that he had defeated all the small dragons and that his level had increased by 3, but he was exhausted and catching his breath. He asked his future self if the Chaos Dragon had run out of small dragons. Suddenly, the dragon reappeared in front of him and spat out another attack. He was stunned and jumped away just as the attack was about to hit him, then watched it explode, destroying the ground. He narrowly avoided being caught in the blast. The dragon gathered power in its mouth again, and he was shocked to see it attacking once more. He quickly ran from his position to avoid the next attack, noting how the hall melted from the dragon's power. He realized he had struggled with the small fires and had used too much stamina, now reaching his limits. He knew he'd have to wait a few more minutes before he could go all out and must somehow strike at its weakness, the dragon core. He sprinted toward the dragon, but stopped abruptly when he saw it fly higher. His future self, smiling, told him that his attacks wouldn't reach it all the way up there. He growled in frustration, cursing under his breath as he wondered what to do next. Glancing around, he searched for anything that might help. His eyes landed on unused containers and trains, sparking an idea. He thought that if he executed his plan, he might get closer to the dragon. His future self asked what he was planning to do, noting that the situation was growing more dire by the second. Ignoring the caution, he grabbed the plushie and dragged it along as he ran. He then leaped onto the containers and up to a pole. His future self yelled that even from such a height, he still wouldn't be able to reach the dragon, to which he responded that he knew. He swung the plushie backward to gain momentum, then hurled it hard toward the dragon, shocking his future self. Next, he cast his stop chain spell on the plushie. After that, he leaped towards the plushie and then onto the dragon, causing his future self to shout in shock and disbelief. He yelled at the dragon that he wouldn't let it transform into miasma again and used his stop chain spell to grab the dragon. He knew that such an enemy couldn't be restrained for more than a few seconds, but that was all the time he needed. He thrust his sword towards the dragon's core, struggling because it was extremely hard. He noticed his chain was fading, so he pushed his sword with all his might into the core. As the stop chain shattered, freeing the dragon, he channeled all his magic power into the sword, shattering the dragon's core. It screamed in pain, and fortunately, the core cracked and then exploded, while the plushie fell face first to the ground. A minute later, he emerged from the smoke with a broken sword. But triumphantly, he had managed to defeat the Chaos Dragon on his own. The dead dragon slowly disappeared, and the system displayed that his level had increased by 15, his swordsman's skill by 28, and he had obtained 872,300 credits. He also obtained a material, Chaos Dragon Feng. The system then advised him to check the upgrading options for Adventurer Rank C and recommended visiting the nearest adventure guild. His future self told him that he had done as well as expected. However, he used him as a stepping stone to gain some footing. Angrily, his future self the meaning of this, but he just ignored him while looking at the system. The system then showed that his secret skill, space-time magic, had increased by 20 levels, and his material rewind and quick body skills had increased by 2 levels each. His space-time mage's passive skill had also increased by 2 levels, and he obtained 50% potential unleashing. His future self told him that they had managed to avert a catastrophic event from repeating in the future, so he guessed it was fine and they had achieved what they wanted. Suddenly, his future self heard something approaching and warned him that it seemed like someone had reported the incident, which could be bad for them if discovered. His future self then jumped on his shoulder and told him that they were leaving now. He told his future self that it was rare for them to agree on something. He then jumped in